The hospital hallway was almost empty when the officer forced open the door. He wasn't there to arrest anyone. He wasn't there to protect anyone. He had one order, whispered to him by a voice he trusted without question, and the order was simple. Make sure the black woman in room 417 never spoke to the police again. But when he stepped into the dark room, she slowly opened her eyes, and she didn't scream, and she didn't run. She simply stared at his badge and whispered that he was 3 minutes late. He froze, because she knew his name, and she knew who sent him. And worst of all, the phone recording hidden beneath her pillow had already captured everything he had just said. The building at night felt like a different world than it did during the day. The fluorescent lights along the corridor flickered in a slow, tired rhythm, and the nurses' station down the hall had been left unattended for exactly the length of time someone would need if they knew the schedule well. Somewhere, a machine beeped in a distant room, steady and indifferent to everything that was about to happen. Nia Whitmore lay in bed, with her eyes closed, her breathing even, her body still recovering from a car accident that everyone kept calling ordinary. She was not asleep. She had learned, over the past 2 days, that pretending to be weaker than she was gave her an advantage that nothing else could buy. The door didn't creak. It simply opened, pushed by a hand that knew exactly how much pressure to use, so the hinges wouldn't complain. The man who entered wasn't wearing a white coat, and he wasn't carrying a clipboard. He was in uniform, the kind of uniform that made most people relax without thinking, the kind that carried authority the way a badge carries weight even when nobody checks what's behind it. Officer Camden Rourke stepped into the room without knocking, without announcing himself, without doing any of the small courtesies that separate a visit from an intrusion. He moved like a man completing a task he didn't want to examine too closely. His boots made almost no sound against the tile floor, the kind of quiet that comes from practice rather than accident. He paused just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness, scanning the room the way someone scans a place they've been told to control rather than a place they've been told to help. The monitor beside the bed traced a slow, even rhythm across its screen, the numbers glowing pale green, indifferent to the man now standing a few feet away from the woman they were measuring. He glanced once toward the window, checked the position of the blinds, confirmed no one outside could see clearly into the room, and only then did he turn his full attention toward the bed. Nia opened her eyes. She didn't gasp. She didn't reach for the call button. She simply looked at him, calm in a way that unsettled him more than fear would have, and let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of question. Camden told her she needed to come with him, his voice low, practiced, the tone of someone who had said similar words to other people in other rooms and never once had to explain himself. Nia didn't answer right away. She let her eyes drift from his face down to the badge on his chest, then to the clock on the wall behind him, its red numbers glowing faintly in the dark. "You're 3 minutes late," she said. Camden felt something shift in his stomach, though he couldn't yet name it. He asked her what she meant, and she told him, without raising her voice, that Detective Voss had said he would arrive at 2:10. The color left Camden's face the way water leaves a cracked glass, slow at first, then all at once. He hadn't told anyone the exact time he planned to enter the room. He hadn't told anyone at all, except the man who had given him the assignment over a phone call that was supposed to be private, supposed to be untraceable, supposed to disappear the moment it ended. Nia sat up slightly against her pillows, wincing only a little from the movement, and watched him the way a person watches a storm they've already prepared for. She understood something about fear that most people never learn, which is that it works best on people who don't expect it. And Camden had walked into this room expecting a frightened patient, not a woman who already knew the shape of the trap closing around her. The gap between what he expected and what he found was where his control had gone to die. "Who told you that name?" Camden asked, and his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Nia didn't answer immediately. Instead, her eyes moved to the small security camera mounted above the doorframe, its tiny red light steady, watching. Camden followed her gaze and understood in an instant what she was implying, and his jaw tightened. He asked where her phone was, sharper now, and Nia only tilted her head toward the small table beside the bed. When he looked, the phone wasn't there. He had been told to remove it before anyone noticed, and for one brief moment, he believed he still had command of the situation. "You should check your left pocket," Nia said. Camden reached into his pocket without thinking, the way a person obeys an instruction before questioning why they're obeying it, and his fingers closed around something small and cold. He pulled it out and stared at a USB drive he had never placed there, had never seen before, had no memory of acquiring. He turned it over in his hand, as though the object itself might explain how it had appeared. Nia watched him with the patience of someone who had planned this moment long before he ever opened the door, and she told him quietly that it wasn't hers. His composure, thin as it already was, began to crack at the edges. He demanded to know what was happening, his voice rising for the first time, and Nia let the question sit in the air unanswered, because some silences do more work than any explanation could. Before she had ever come to this hospital, before the accident that everyone insisted was routine, She had already copied everything she found, every file, every inconsistency, every name that shouldn't have appeared where it appeared. But she didn't tell him what that data actually contained. Not yet. Not until it mattered more than his patience could bear. Camden paced twice toward the window and back, running a hand through his hair, the movement of a man trying to think his way out of a situation that refused to make sense. He had taken this assignment, believing it was routine, a favor called in between colleagues, a quiet task meant to protect an ongoing investigation from a witness who might complicate things. Nobody had told him the witness would already know the exact minute he planned to arrive. Nobody had told him she would carry herself like someone standing on solid ground, while he stood on ice that had already begun to crack beneath his boots. He tried a different approach, softening his tone, telling her that he only wanted to talk, that nobody needed to get hurt tonight if she simply cooperated. Nia studied him for a long moment before answering, and when she spoke, her voice carried no accusation, only observation. She told him that men who only wanted to talk rarely needed to enter a hospital room after visiting hours without identifying themselves at the front desk. Camden had no answer for that, because there wasn't one that didn't confirm exactly what she already suspected. Camden demanded her password. Nia refused, calm as still water, and when he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the tension along his jaw, she only said that if she disappeared tonight, someone would receive the file by morning. Camden stopped where he stood. He didn't know who that someone was, and the not knowing terrified him more than any threat could have, because a threat has an edge you can measure, and this had none. 48 hours earlier, the world had looked ordinary. Nia had been driving home from work, the radio low, her mind still occupied with spreadsheets and claimed numbers from her job as a data analyst at a mid-sized health insurance company. She noticed the truck before she understood what it was doing. A heavy shape, drifting across the center line, with no warning, no hesitation, no correction. She remembered pressing the brake pedal with everything she had. She remembered the sound before the impact more clearly than the impact itself, a strange, high whine of tires that didn't belong to her own car. She survived. That single fact would later feel less like luck and more like an oversight, though she wouldn't understand why for several more days. In the hospital, while nurses checked her vitals and doctors spoke to her, in the gentle, distant tone reserved for patients who might not remember any of it later, Nia asked to see the accident report. It arrived eventually, printed on plain paper, stamped with an official seal that was supposed to mean something. One line stopped her breathing for a moment. The report claimed the driver failed to brake. She remembered pressing that pedal until her leg ached. She remembered it the way a person remembers the last thing they did before everything changed. She read the report 3 more times that night, searching for some detail she might have missed. Some explanation that would make the sentence feel less wrong. There wasn't one. The paragraph describing the moment of impact read like something written by a person who hadn't been there, who hadn't felt the seatbelt lock across her chest, or heard the particular scream of metal folding against metal. She noticed, too, that the officer who signed the report wasn't the same officer who had spoken with her at the scene, a small inconsistency that most people would have dismissed as clerical accident. Nia had spent years reading insurance claims for a living, and she knew that inconsistencies were rarely accidents. They were almost always the residue of something someone had tried, imperfectly, to smooth over. She began asking questions carefully, the way a person tests ice before deciding whether to walk further out onto it. She asked a nurse, casually, whether hospital records were ever shared with police departments before a patient consented. She asked a hospital administrator, just as casually, who had requested her room assignment on the 3rd floor instead of the 2nd, where most accident patients were kept. The answers she received were vague, polite, and entirely unsatisfying, the kind of answers designed to end a conversation rather than inform it. Each one only sharpened the question underneath all of them, which was simple enough to keep her awake at night. Why did so many small, ordinary decisions about her case seem to have been made by someone other than the people whose names appeared on the paperwork? She asked to see the vehicle's internal data, the kind of information modern cars record automatically: speed, braking pressure, timing down to fractions of a second. The request was denied, quietly, without much explanation, the way requests get denied, when someone somewhere has already decided the answer before the question was asked. A few days later, an anonymous email arrived in her personal account, sent from an address that led nowhere when she tried to trace it. The message contained only one sentence: "Stop looking at the numbers." Nia read it twice. Then she understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than the accident had, that whoever sent it already knew she was looking. She began digging through old files at work during her recovery, cross-referencing insurance claims tied to accidents that shared strange similarities. Cases closed faster than they should have been. Witnesses whose statements changed after the fact, sometimes within hours, sometimes within days. Reports that read like templates instead of individual events, as if someone had written the outcome before the accident occurred. And one name kept surfacing in the margins of those files, appearing in places it had no obvious reason to be: Elias Voss. She opened one final document late that night, her hands trembling slightly from exhaustion rather than fear. Inside it, buried among case numbers and dates, was her own name. Back in the present, Camden still stood frozen in the middle of the room, the USB drive heavy in his hand, though it weighed almost nothing at all. Nia asked him, gently, whether Voss had told him she was dangerous. Camden said nothing. She asked whether Voss had told him instead that she was lying, that she was unstable, that she couldn't be trusted, and still, he offered no answer. Because both questions landed somewhere true, and he didn't know how to defend against truth he hadn't examined himself. She realized, watching him, that he wasn't the architect of any of this. He was a tool, sharpened and pointed in a direction he hadn't chosen for himself. So she changed her approach. She stopped treating him as a threat, and started treating him as a man, standing at the edge of a decision he didn't yet know he was allowed to make. Her voice softened, not out of weakness, but out of strategy, the same way a negotiator lowers their tone to bring a situation down from its peak. She showed him a portion of the data on a small tablet she kept hidden beneath the blanket, careful to reveal only what she needed him to see. Camden's eyes moved across the screen, and somewhere in the numbers and names he recognized something. A case file. An old one. One he had worked years earlier as a younger officer, back when he still believed every assignment made the world a little safer. He hadn't thought about it in years, and seeing it now felt like touching a wound he didn't know was still open. He asked her why she hadn't taken any of this to the police already. Nia looked at him without blinking, and told him she had. He asked when. She said yesterday. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer, because both of them understood at the same moment exactly who had received her complaint. It was Elias Voss himself. The man tasked with investigating her concerns was the same man whose name kept appearing inside them. Camden's expression changed slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room, image emerging from what had seemed like nothing. He understood, finally, that he hadn't been sent here to protect an investigation. He had been sent here to erase a witness the system had already decided to ignore. Outside the room, the corridor's small security camera flickered once, and then went dark, its feed replaced by a frozen frame that no one monitoring would notice for several minutes. A nurse walked past without realizing anything was wrong. Dr. Celeste Marrow, making her rounds earlier than scheduled, noticed the door to room 417 had been left open in a way that violated every protocol the hospital enforced for patients under observation. She asked the security guard posted nearby what was happening, and he told her it was a police matter. His tone meant to end the conversation before it began. Celeste did not accept that answer, because she had learned long ago that vague authority was usually hiding something specific. Celeste did not walk away from the security guard's dismissal. She asked for his supervisor's name, and when he hesitated to give it, she told him plainly that she would be documenting this conversation in the hospital's incident log, regardless of whether he cooperated. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle him, and he suggested she speak with whoever was inside the room herself, if she had concerns. Celeste moved toward the door with the unhurried determination of someone who had spent 30 years learning that hesitation cost patients far more than confrontation ever did. Inside the room, Camden's phone buzzed once. He answered it quietly, turning slightly away from Nia, though she could still hear enough of the voice on the other end to understand its urgency. The instruction was short. Finish it. Nothing more specific was said, because nothing more specific needed to be said. The meaning sat clearly beneath the words, the way certain instructions always do when spoken between people who already understand each other. Camden looked at Nia. Nia looked back at him without flinching, and told him he still had a choice. He asked her, quietly, what kind of choice she meant. She told him he could walk out of this room as the man who had entered it, following orders without asking what they served, or he could walk out as the man who finally saw what was happening around him and refused to look away. It was a small sentence, but it landed with the weight of something much larger, because he understood she wasn't only talking about tonight. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he lowered his phone, opened a recording application, and set it quietly on the small table beside her bed, the screen facing downward, so it wouldn't draw attention. It was the first act of defiance he had committed in longer than he could remember. But, before either of them could take another breath, the door swung open again, harder this time, and the man who stepped through it filled the doorway with a presence that made the room feel smaller. Detective Elias Voss looked at Camden first, his eyes narrowing with quiet disappointment, and then at Nia, whose expression hadn't changed at all. He said, in a voice that carried more surprise than menace, that she wasn't supposed to be alive. Nia didn't flinch. She only asked, calmly, alive after which part? Voss realized, a half-second too late, exactly how much he had just revealed. Camden turned to look at him fully now, the air in the room shifting in a way that felt almost physical, a pressure change before a storm. Voss recovered quickly, the way men who have spent decades learning to control a room always do. He smoothed his expression back into something professional, something reasonable, and told Nia that her recovery must have been remarkable, given the severity of the report he had read. Nia let the remark sit for a moment, before answering that reports could say almost anything, depending on who wrote them and what they needed the person reviewing them to believe. Voss's jaw tightened, barely, but Camden noticed it, and something in him that had spent years trusting this man began, quietly and irreversibly, to come apart. Voss stepped further into the room, positioning himself between the bed and the door, a movement so practiced it barely registered as deliberate, though Nia registered it immediately. She had read enough behavioral patterns in claims investigations to recognize control when she saw it. The small architecture of dominance built from posture and positioning rather than words. She didn't move to counter it. She simply continued speaking, letting her voice remain level, because she understood that panic was the only thing that could still hand him an advantage in this room, and she refused to give it to him. Nia began speaking, slowly, methodically, laying out everything she understood so far. She knew about the accident, and she knew it hadn't been random. She knew about the files that had been quietly edited to erase inconsistencies. She knew about witnesses who had vanished from official records as though they had never existed at all. She knew about reports rewritten to match a story instead of the truth. And she knew about phone calls between Voss and someone above him, calls that had left traces, even when the people making them assumed they hadn't. What she still lacked was the piece that connected everything directly to him, the thread that would turn suspicion into proof. Voss reached for her phone, his movement quick, almost desperate, but Nia's voice stopped him before his fingers closed around it. She told him he should really stop touching evidence. He hesitated, and in that hesitation she gestured toward a small device tucked beneath her pillow, a recorder she had placed there long before he ever walked into the room. Voss understood, with a sinking clarity, that every word spoken inside these walls tonight had already been captured. He tried to recover his composure, forcing a thin smile onto his face, and told her that a recording proved nothing about who had given the orders. Nia agreed with him, calmly, and reached for a second phone hidden in the folds of her blanket. She opened a video file and turned the screen toward him. On it, Voss appeared, clearly, unmistakably, speaking with another man in a location that meant something specific to anyone who understood the timeline of the accident. The man in the video wasn't Camden. It was Deputy Chief Julian Pike. The footage showed the two men meeting days before Nia's accident, their conversation inaudible in most of the clip, but their body language unmistakable, hurried, secretive, careful. There was no direct confession captured on the recording, no single sentence that could stand alone as proof. But the timing, the location, and the pattern it created alongside everything else Nia had gathered began to form a structure too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Camden stared at the screen and felt something inside him finally settle into place, the last piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized he'd been avoiding. Nia explained how she had obtained it, careful and measured, describing a source she declined to name even now. Someone inside the department who had grown tired of watching cases disappear into drawers that never reopened. Voss listened with his jaw set tight, his eyes flicking toward the door, as though calculating distance and time. And Nia noticed the calculation, and addressed it directly, telling him that leaving the room now would only confirm everything the footage already suggested. He stayed where he was, not because he wanted to, but because he understood, finally, that there was nowhere left to go that wouldn't make things worse. Julian Pike had always been a careful man, the kind who rose through the ranks, not through dramatic victories, but through the quiet accumulation of favors owed and debts collected. Nobody in the department had ever seen him raise his voice. Nobody had ever caught him making a decision that could later be traced directly back to a single signature. He preferred instructions delivered through intermediaries, requests phrased as suggestions, and problems solved before they ever became visible enough to require his name. It was, Nia would later realize, the exact same discipline that had almost let him disappear from this story entirely, if not for one video clip that placed him in the wrong location on the wrong afternoon. Voss tried, once more, to steer the conversation somewhere safer. He told Camden that he didn't understand the larger picture, that there were things happening far beyond a single case, far beyond a single officer's judgment. Camden asked him, evenly, to explain it then, to lay it out clearly if it was truly so complicated, so justified, so necessary. Voss opened his mouth and found no words waiting there. Some silences reveal more than any speech ever could, and this was one of them. Outside, Dr. Celeste had already made a call of her own. Within minutes, a woman in a dark coat walked briskly down the hallway, her presence calm but unmistakably purposeful. Mara Ellison, a civil rights attorney, who had built her reputation on cases most people considered unwinnable, entered the room and immediately demanded that every officer present step outside. Voss protested, insisting this was an internal matter, but Mara told him plainly that they could continue this conversation in a courtroom instead, where the rules would no longer bend in his favor. Nia handed Mara a copy of the data she had gathered, and Mara reviewed it in silence, her expression shifting from professional skepticism to something far more serious. She realized quickly that these files hadn't simply been altered once, in a moment of panic or convenience. They had been altered repeatedly, over years, following a consistent pattern that could not be explained by a single person acting alone. This wasn't a mistake. This was a system, built carefully enough to survive scrutiny for a very long time. Mara had built her entire career on skepticism, on the assumption that most stories brought to her office collapsed under close examination long before they ever reached a courtroom. She had expected, walking into this hospital, to find a frightened woman with a theory too fragile to survive cross-examination. Instead, she found spreadsheets cross-referenced with case numbers, dates aligned with precision, and a pattern so consistent it read less like coincidence and more like a signature. She flipped through several pages twice, checking her own math against Nia's, and found no error in either direction. Somewhere in the middle of that silent review, her posture changed, straightening slightly, the way a person's posture changes when they stop preparing to argue and start preparing to fight. She asked Nia how long it had taken to compile all of this, and Nia told her nearly a year, pieced together during lunch breaks and late evenings, hidden inside spreadsheets that looked, to anyone glancing over her shoulder, like ordinary insurance work. Mara looked at her for a long moment, something like respect settling into her expression, and admitted that most people who stumbled onto something this large simply walked away from it, because walking away was safer, and safer usually won. Nia told her, simply, that safety had never been the point. Mara asked Nia who else had access to the original files, her voice quieter now, aware of how much depended on the answer. Nia told her that someone she had never named held a copy, someone who existed entirely outside the circle of people currently standing in this room. Nia revealed, calmly, that she had never been as vulnerable as everyone assumed. From the moment she first noticed the irregular pattern in the insurance data, she had understood the danger of trusting a single point of failure. She had split the information into separate pieces instead of keeping it whole. One portion went to an attorney she trusted. Another went to a doctor whose integrity she had quietly tested over the following days. A third piece was locked inside an independent storage system, with no connection to her usual accounts. The final piece was set to release automatically, timed to a schedule only she controlled. If she failed to confirm her safety before a certain hour, the entire collection of evidence would be transmitted without her needing to lift a finger. She explained it plainly, without any theatrical flourish, the way she might have explained a claims process to a confused customer over the phone. There was no dramatic countdown, no red numbers ticking toward zero, the way stories sometimes imagine these things. There was only a simple, quiet mechanism, built by a woman who understood that the most dangerous thing she could do was let anyone believe she was the only obstacle standing between them and silence. Every person who threatened her that night was, in truth, threatening a system already designed to survive her disappearance. Voss understood, watching her explain this with the same steady voice she had used since the moment he entered the room, that silencing her through simple means had never truly been an option. Pike, still trying to manage the unraveling situation from wherever he was, called the hospital directly and demanded Nia be transferred to a different section, citing vague security concerns that meant nothing under real scrutiny. Celeste refused outright. Mara demanded a written order, something official, something that could be reviewed later, and Pike, predictably, could not produce one. At that exact moment, a notification appeared on Mara's phone, brief and final. Scheduled transmission completed. The data reached multiple recipients within minutes, spreading in a way that no single person could contain or reverse. There was no need to describe the technical process in detail. What mattered was what happened next. An independent investigation opened almost immediately. Old case files, long buried under layers of bureaucratic dust, were pulled and re-examined by people who had no reason to protect the names inside them. Reports once closed without explanation were reopened, their inconsistencies now impossible to ignore. Voss was suspended within the week. Pike came under formal investigation shortly after, his careful public composure beginning to fracture under the weight of questions he could no longer avoid. Camden, to the surprise of many who had known him only as a quiet, obedient officer, came forward voluntarily and gave a full statement about everything he had witnessed and everything he had nearly done. The recording captured inside the hospital room became one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire case. A small device tucked beneath a pillow that had quietly recorded the unraveling of something much larger than one night. Reporters began circling the story within days, drawn by the strange, almost cinematic detail of an officer sent to silence a patient who had already outmaneuvered him before he finished crossing the threshold. Nia refused most interview requests, choosing instead to let the paperwork speak, where she remained silent, because she understood that a story told too early could be twisted by people who still had reasons to twist it. Dr. Celeste testified about the irregular transfer request and the pressure applied against hospital staff, her account calm and unshaken under questioning, exactly as everyone who knew her expected it would be. The independent investigators, once they began pulling threads, found more than anyone initially expected. Other cases surfaced, other names, other patterns stretching back further than the file Nia had first discovered. Some of the people affected had never known why their claims were denied or their reports altered, had simply absorbed the loss as bad luck rather than deliberate design. For them, the investigation didn't just expose wrongdoing. It gave language to something they had felt for years without being able to name, the quiet certainty that the system had never truly been built to see them. Yet Nia didn't celebrate. When Mara asked her how it felt to finally see the truth come out, Nia told her this had never been about destroying anyone. Mara asked her then what it had been about. Nia answered simply that it was about making sure the same thing couldn't happen to someone else, that the next person caught inside a system built to silence them wouldn't have to fight alone in a locked room at 2 a.m. It was, in its own quiet way, the moment her character finally completed its arc. She had begun this ordeal believing that evidence alone would be enough, that truth carried its own gravity and would eventually pull justice toward it without much help. She had learned, through every locked door and every quiet threat, that truth needed someone willing to carry it forward, someone patient enough to survive the waiting and steady enough not to flinch when the walls closed in. Camden visited her one final time before the formal hearings began. He apologized, his voice lacking the confidence it once carried, and Nia didn't offer immediate forgiveness, because forgiveness wasn't hers to give lightly, not after everything his uniform had nearly done to her. She told him plainly that he didn't need her forgiveness. A pause stretched between them, heavy, but not unkind. What he needed, she said, was to tell the truth, fully and without protection for anyone above him, no matter how uncomfortable that truth became. Camden made his decision there, standing in the doorway of a hospital he had once entered to silence her. He chose to testify publicly. Months passed before Nia was fully discharged from the hospital. The physical injuries from the accident healed long before the deeper questions surrounding it were resolved. On the day she finally walked out, she moved down the same corridor where everything had started, past the door of room 417, now empty, now fitted with new security cameras installed as part of updated hospital protocols. The changes were small compared to everything that had happened, but they mattered because they meant the next patient in that room would not face the same silence she once had. The investigation continued long after she left, threading through departments and offices that had grown comfortable, assuming no one would ever look closely enough to notice the pattern. Not everything resolved cleanly. Some questions remained open, some names remained unaddressed publicly, and some parts of the system resisted change the way old structures always do. But the truth, once it left that locked room, could no longer be contained inside 4 walls and a closed door. It had already traveled too far for that. Nia received a call from Mara one afternoon, her voice carrying the particular calm of someone delivering important news carefully. They wanted her to testify formally, before a full hearing, on the record, with her name attached to every claim she had gathered. Nia agreed without hesitation, the decision already made long before the question was even asked. The hearing itself unfolded without theatrics. Nia sat before a panel of officials, whose expressions ranged from cautious respect to poorly hidden discomfort, and she did not raise her voice, did not perform outrage for an audience, did not seek revenge, dressed up as justice. She simply presented what she knew, one fact after another, names given in full, dates confirmed against records, evidence laid out with the same careful precision she had once used to compile insurance data for a company that never imagined its systems would one day expose something so much larger. Mara sat beside her throughout, occasionally passing a note or clarifying a procedural point. But for the most part, she let Nia speak in her own voice. Because the story landed harder coming from the person who had lived it than it ever could, through a lawyer's careful paraphrasing. Camden testified 2 days later, his statement matching hers in every meaningful detail. His account of that night in room 417 delivered without excuses, without softening the moments that reflected poorly on himself. He told the panel plainly that he had walked into that room prepared to follow an order he never should have accepted, and that the only reason he hadn't gone through with it was the woman sitting across the room, calm enough in the face of real danger to make him question everything he thought he understood about his job. Pike did not testify voluntarily. When his name was called, he arrived with a team of attorneys who spent more time objecting to procedure than answering questions directly, and the contrast between his evasiveness and Nia's plain, documented clarity did more damage to his credibility than any single piece of evidence could have. Voss, for his part, offered a statement that shifted blame in several directions at once, blaming pressure from above, blaming a culture he claimed he hadn't created, blaming circumstances that conveniently absolved him of every individual choice he had personally made along the way. The panel did not appear persuaded. Near the end of her testimony, One of the panel members asked her a question that lingered in the room long after she answered it. He asked why she had kept fighting when the people opposing her held so much more power than she did. Nia looked forward, steady, unwavering, and told him that power only worked when everyone else decided to be afraid of it. The hearing concluded 3 weeks later, its final report running to hundreds of pages, most of them filled with names and dates that would mean little to anyone outside the process, but meant everything to the people who had spent years believing their cases had simply been misfortune. Voss faced formal charges. Pike resigned before the panel could finish its recommendations, a resignation that fooled no one into believing he had chosen it freely. Camden kept his position, though changed in ways that colleagues noticed even if they didn't fully understand them, quieter in some rooms and considerably louder in others, particularly whenever a younger officer suggested that following orders was reason enough to stop asking questions. Dr. Celeste eventually helped draft new hospital guidelines governing law enforcement access to patients. Protocols now taught to every new employee during orientation. A small, procedural legacy of one impossible night in room 417. Mara took on 3 additional cases within the following year, each one uncovered by people who had read about Nia's story and recognized, for the first time, a pattern they had lived through themselves, without ever having language for it. She walked out of the building afterward into ordinary daylight, the kind of afternoon that carried no particular symbolism except the simple fact that she was still standing in it. There was no crowd waiting to celebrate her, no dramatic music swelling behind her steps, no need for any of that. She had already won, in the way that mattered most, because the men who once walked into a hospital room, believing they could make her disappear, had instead forced an entire system to speak the truth. It had spent years trying to bury. She thought, walking down the courthouse steps into the afternoon light, about the version of herself lying in that hospital bed weeks earlier, pretending to sleep, listening to footsteps she hadn't yet learned to fear. That woman had been afraid. Whatever calm she managed to project, because fear and composure had never been opposites for her, only 2 things she had learned to hold at the same time, without letting either one win. She understood now that the calm hadn't come from an absence of fear. It had come from refusing to let fear make her decisions for her, refusing to let it decide what she noticed, what she remembered, what she was willing to say out loud when the moment finally demanded it. They came to silence her. Instead, she became the reason the silence finally broke.